Imagine opening your kitchen cupboard and realizing you need to make the food you already have last longer. No expensive grocery run, no ordering dinner, no walking into a supermarket where every shelf is full, just a garden, a pantry, a cellar, and the knowledge to turn a few seeds into months of meals. For generations, many Amish families treated the garden as more than a hobby. It was part of the household economy. A good garden meant vegetables on the table in summer, jars in the pantry for winter, and fewer dollars leaving the farm when money was tight. And no, not every Amish family grew the exact same crops. Communities differ, climates differ, and gardens differ. But certain vegetables appeared again and again because they did something more valuable than simply taste good. They grew heavily, they stored well, they fed large families, and they could be turned into soup, stew, pickles, casseroles, side dishes, and winter meals when fresh food was scarce. Number 3 on this list can sit in storage for months without a freezer. Number 2 keeps producing the more you pick it. And number 1 has fed families through hard times all over the world because one small patch can become the base of dozens of meals. These are 13 vegetables Amish families often relied on when money was tight. Number 13, lettuce. Lettuce may not sound like a survival vegetable, but it earned its place because it was fast. When you planted lettuce, you did not have to wait all season for a reward. In many gardens, outer leaves could be picked early while the plant continued growing. That meant one small row could provide fresh greens again and again. For a family trying to stretch meals, lettuce added something important: freshness. A simple dinner of potatoes, beans, bread, and leftovers could feel completely different with a bowl of crisp greens on the table. Lettuce gave families a way to eat something fresh without spending money on store-bought salads. The key was not planting everything at once. A frugal gardener planted small amounts every couple of weeks. That way, one crop did not all mature at the same time. It was not the biggest crop in the garden, but it was one of the quickest reminders that the garden was already giving something back. Number 12, peas. Peas were one of the first true signs that winter was over. After months of stored potatoes, onions, root vegetables, and canned food, peas brought sweetness back to the table. Fresh peas straight from the pod were a small luxury in households that did not waste money. But peas were valuable for more than their taste. They grew early in the season, before many warm weather vegetables were ready. That made them useful during the hungry gap, the period when winter stores were running low, but the main summer garden had not yet produced much food. Families could eat peas fresh, shell them for dinner, preserve them, or dry them for soups. And because peas are legumes, they also helped improve the soil for the crops that followed. A row of peas did not just produce food, it helped prepare the ground for the rest of the garden. Number 11, radishes. Radishes were the vegetable for impatient gardeners. They could be ready in a matter of weeks. That mattered when a family had planted a garden but was still waiting for the larger crops to grow. Radishes were often planted in empty spaces between slower vegetables or at the edge of rows. They did not need much room. They did not demand a long season, and they gave a gardener something to harvest almost immediately. Their sharp, peppery taste was not for everyone, but when money was tight, a vegetable did not have to be fancy to be useful. Radishes added crunch to meals, stretched simple salads, and gave families something fresh before beans, corn, tomatoes, and potatoes were ready. They taught an important garden lesson. Every empty piece of soil could become food. Number 10, kale. Kale was valuable because it refused to quit. Heat, cold, light frost, poor soil. Kale could keep going when more delicate vegetables had already failed. In a practical garden, that kind of reliability was worth more than novelty. A family could harvest the lower leaves while allowing the plant to continue growing. That meant a few kale plants could keep producing for a long time. It could be cooked into soups, sautéed with onions, added to beans, mixed into potatoes, or simply boiled down as a side dish. It was not glamorous, but it was dependable. And when the first cold weather arrived, kale often became sweeter. That is why it belonged in gardens built around thrift. It offered fresh green food long after lettuce had bolted and tomatoes had faded. When the goal was feeding a household instead of decorating a plate, kale made sense. Number 9. Beets. Beets gave a family 2 vegetables from one plant. The roots could be roasted, boiled, pickled, or stored for winter. The tops could be cooked like greens. Nothing had to be wasted. That was the kind of thinking that mattered in a frugal household. Beets also stored well. After harvesting in fall, they could be kept in a cool cellar or packed in damp sand. Months later, they could still be sliced into a stew, cooked beside potatoes, or pickled in jars. Pickling was especially valuable because it turned a seasonal harvest into food that lasted. A garden did not only feed the family during summer, it could still feed them in January. Beets may be humble, but they were colorful, filling, and practical. They made a plate look alive during a season when fresh produce was hard to come by. Number 8. Carrots. Carrots were one of the great storage vegetables. Once harvested, they could be kept for months in a cool, dark place. For families without modern refrigeration, that was a major advantage. A good carrot harvest could become soups, stews, roasts, casseroles, and side dishes all winter long. They were sweet enough for children, useful enough for adults, and flexible enough to appear in almost any meal. Carrots also helped stretch more expensive foods. A small amount of meat could become a larger stew when carrots, onions, potatoes, and beans were added. That is how a family made one roast last for more than one meal. The old garden wisdom was simple: grow crops that work hard in the kitchen. Carrots did exactly that. They were cheap to grow, easy to store, and useful from harvest season until spring. Number 7. Onions. Onions may be one of the least exciting vegetables to grow, but they were among the most important. Think about how many meals begin with an onion. Soup starts with onion. Stew starts with onion. Beans, potatoes, cabbage, gravy, sauces, fried dishes, all of them become more satisfying with onion. That meant growing onions saved money again and again. A family did not have to buy the flavor base for every meal. After harvest, onions could be cured and stored in a dry place for months. Braided together or kept in baskets, they became a kind of kitchen security. When money was tight, flavor mattered. A family could eat the same basic foods repeatedly, but onions made those foods taste different. They turned plain potatoes into fried potatoes. They turned beans into a proper meal. They turned leftover vegetables into soup. A modest onion patch quietly improved almost everything else in the garden. Number 6. Tomatoes. Tomatoes were summer abundance. When they came in, they often came in all at once. That could feel overwhelming, but in a frugal household, abundance was never a problem if you knew how to preserve it. Fresh tomatoes went into sandwiches, salads, and simple meals. The extra tomatoes became sauce, juice, canned tomatoes, relish, and chutney. A good tomato harvest gave a family something valuable: flavor during winter. A jar of home canned tomato sauce could transform beans, pasta, cabbage, or leftover meat into a meal with real depth. It was not just preserved food, it was preserved summer. Tomatoes did require attention. They needed warmth, water, and regular picking, but the payoff was large. A few plants could produce far more than a family could eat fresh. That is exactly why tomatoes belonged in a money-tight garden. They gave more than one season of value. Number 5. Sweet corn. Sweet corn was one of the vegetables that made summer feel generous. It grew tall, took up space, and required patience. But when it was ready, it fed a crowd. Corn could be boiled fresh, cut from the cob, added to soups, turned into corn relish, or preserved for later. For large families, it was a filling crop that children usually enjoyed. It also had a place in the old practice of growing crops close together. Corn could provide support for climbing beans, while squash spread along the ground below. Each plant used space differently. That is practical gardening. Corn reached upward, beans climbed, squash shaded the soil. Instead of seeing a small garden as a limitation, families learned to use every layer of it. Number 4. Cabbage. Cabbage was one of the true workhorses of a frugal garden. It could be eaten fresh, cooked in soups, fried with onions, made into slaw, fermented into sauerkraut, or stored for later. One large head could feed a family more than once. That was its strength. Cabbage was not a one-meal vegetable. It could turn a little meat into a large pot of soup. It could be shredded and cooked with potatoes. It could be preserved when the harvest was larger than the immediate need. And cabbage grew in cooler weather, which which extended the productive season. Modern food culture sometimes treats cabbage as boring. But boring is often another word for dependable. When money was tight, dependable mattered more than exciting. Cabbage was filling, long-lasting, and versatile enough to show up on the table in many different forms. Number 3. Winter squash. Winter squash was food that came with its own storage container. The thick skin protected the flesh inside, allowing squash to sit in a cool, dry place for months. That made it a powerful crop for families preparing for winter. Butternut squash, pumpkins, acorn squash, and other winter varieties could be baked, mashed, roasted, added to soup, or used in pies and breads. A single plant could produce several large squash, and each squash represented more than one meal. That is what made winter squash different from a vegetable that had to be eaten immediately. It gave a family options. When fresh food became scarce, a squash from the cellar could become dinner. When flour was low, it could become bread. When sugar was limited, its natural sweetness could make a plain meal feel more comforting. It was not just a harvest, it was stored security. Number 2. Pole beans. Pole beans were one of the most productive crops a small garden could grow. Once they began producing, families had to keep picking, and the more they picked, the more beans the plants often made. That kind of harvest was perfect for a large household. Beans could be eaten fresh, canned, pickled, dried, or cooked into soups. They were easy to grow vertically, which made them useful in smaller gardens. Instead of taking up wide rows of ground, they climbed poles, strings, fences, or simple wooden frames, and they could keep producing for weeks. That is why beans were more than a summer vegetable. A family could eat them fresh in July, preserve jars in August, and enjoy those jars in winter. Pole beans showed what frugal gardening was really about, getting the maximum return from a small amount of land. Number 1. Potatoes. Potatoes were the foundation. They did not need to be glamorous because they did almost everything. A potato patch could feed a family in ways few other crops could. Potatoes could be boiled, mashed, roasted, fried, baked, turned into soup, added to stews, or served beside almost anything. They were filling, they stored well, and they could make a meal feel complete even when there was very little else available. For households watching every dollar, potatoes created a kind of stability. You could add beans to them, add cabbage, add onions, add leftover meat, add gravy, add milk, add almost anything from the garden, and if the garden gave you nothing else, potatoes could still carry a meal. That is why they belonged at the center of so many practical gardens. They were not simply a side dish. They were insurance. A sack of stored potatoes meant winter dinners. It meant food when wages were low. It meant a family could face a hard week without panic. The real Amish lesson is not that every family should suddenly grow all 13 vegetables. It is that a garden becomes powerful when you choose crops with a purpose. Grow some vegetables that are fast. Grow some that keep producing. Grow some that store through winter. Grow some that turn a small amount of food into a larger meal. If money is tight, start with a few practical choices: potatoes, pole beans, onions, cabbage, carrots, and winter squash. Those 6 crops alone can give you fresh food, storage food, soup food, side dishes, and ingredients that stretch almost every meal. The old gardens were not built to look impressive. They were built to keep families fed, and that is a kind of wisdom worth bringing back. Which vegetable would you grow first?